you see this, pal. The toast of Greenwich Village in his first appearance anywhere, Tiny Tim.
You call, leader?
In 1968, Tiny Tim tiptoed onto the world stage and captivated audiences with his ukulele and falsetto voice. For 2 years, the trippy balladeer's star burned bright.
All of a sudden, within a matter of months, he was a household name on 3 continents. Everybody in North America, Europe, and Australia knew who Tiny Tim was.
But as fast as Tiny Tim became famous, he let it all slip through his fingers.
Oh, everybody took advantage of him. He didn't know how to hold on to a dollar.
He performed in second-class lounges. He performed in motel lounges throughout the nation.
In the next hour, we'll examine Tiny Tim's bizarre life.
Oh, this is different, but it's nothing that will last. This is something that peaks and goes away.
We'll hear about his tortured childhood.
There was this strange, sheltered, kind of bizarre kid growing up, the butt of everyone's joke, who really desperately craved attention.
His strange obsessions.
The relationship was somewhat physical. He was obviously very attracted to this guy.
I think eating was the most sexual act that he was able to engage in.
We'll witness his unlikely climb to stardom.
He pulled out the ukulele out of the shopping bag and went into a song.
We'll hear about the performer's messy relationships.
He felt that the woman should be subservient to the man, that the man will make all the decisions. So that immediately set up a little bit of a barrier between the two of them.
And we'll hear about the woman who stole his heart.
The fact that when he got married to Miss Sue, I think it was a turning point in his life.
This is the story of a screechy-voiced ukulele player whose brush with fame was phenomenal and fleeting. This is the story of Tiny Tim, the E! True Hollywood story. On April 12, 1932, the shrill cry of a newborn baby boy, Herbert Buckingham Corey, echoed through the halls of New York's Park East Hospital. Parents Tilly and Boutros Corey had been married 3 months. Herbert would be their only child. Boutros, a Lebanese Catholic, and his wife Tilly, a Polish Jew, both worked in New York City's garment district. The family lived on the first floor of a 5-story tenement building in Washington Heights, north of Manhattan. Herbert's cousin, Bernie Stein, lived on the 5th floor.
It was a typical New York melting pot neighborhood, predominantly Irish, with a mixture of Italian, Jewish, and German thrown in. Everybody knew everybody else.
Young Herbert was an odd, introspective child who was hooked on comic books and the Brooklyn Dodgers. At age 5, he discovered turn-of-the-century Tin Pan Alley music and spent hours winding the family Victrola to listen to records. The gentle boy played street ball with the neighborhood kids, but he was often picked on for being too goody-goody. Journalist and biographer Harry Stein.
There was this strange, sheltered, kind of bizarre kid growing up, the butt of everyone's joke, who really desperately craved attention.
Herbert got plenty of attention from his mother, but it was often negative. Tilly simply never understood why her son wasn't like the other neighborhood children.
You know, he always said, oh, but I love my mother, but then he would talk about what she had done to him, how she had really beaten him up psychically.
In 1943, 11-year-old Herbert took up the violin. Herbert's cousin, Hal Stein.
His first stage appearance was in a Christmas play, and that was his first musical performance before an audience. And from that violin, he learned to do the ukulele, the mandolin, and the guitar, and all his other instruments.
Herbert loved performing for his parents after dinner. Then, one night in 1945, the 13-year-old had an appendicitis attack.
He took his appendix out, and after that, it sort of it was kind of different.
The change began to take place. He spent a lot of time listening to Russ Columbo and Rudy Vallée records by himself. He listened to the radio. He sang a lot, played his ukulele.
Record producer and friend, Richard Perry.
There was no television, and he would just put his ear as close as he could to the radio and listen to all these voices of the spirits that now lived within him.
At home, Herbert rarely ventured out of his room. He studied the Bible intently. At school, he was deeply fascinated with the opposite sex. He often stared at his favorite girls in class, but that's as far as he would go.
And the whole sexual element of his personality troubled him a great deal because he had this kind of self-styled religion that he took very seriously. He was very, very ambivalent about sex. He was, on the one hand, incredibly interested in sex. On the other hand, thought it was filthy and dirty.
Herbert's first sexual experience was with a male friend.
The relationship was somewhat physical. They would give each other back rubs. But, and he described at one point spilling his SEED during the course of one of these things. He was obviously very attracted to this guy. He grappled with it, I think, as a religious question. He was very concerned with his immortal soul.
He was more concerned with his immortal soul than grades. Herbert repeated his sophomore year at George Washington High School, and then quit altogether. With little formal education, the dropout pounded the streets looking for work, landing one menial job after another. In 1950, 18-year-old Herbert experienced what he termed a religious vision. In this 1969 interview, the performer explained the change.
It was something of a new revelation. I never knew that I had a higher top register. And one day I heard Rudy Vallée sing, and I said, gee, look how high he hits those notes. I consider this a gift of the Lord, an undisclosed gift.
In March 1951, Herbert became a messenger at the New York offices of MGM Studios. It was his dream job.
He had a big crush on Elizabeth Taylor. He was showbiz struck in general.
Herbert was unable to afford an apartment in the city, so he lived at home with his parents. To make extra cash, Herbert began appearing at dance club amateur nights from New Jersey to Long Island. He dressed in colorful clothes, played ukulele, and sang under a multitude of stage names, including Texarkana Tex, Judas K. Foxglove, Vernon Castle, and Emmett Swink.
He would switch from his high voice to his low voice. He would do duets with himself.
Audiences were caught off guard by the performer's falsetto voice.
I did use it in amateur shows where there were a lot of good singers to break the boredom.
In 1954, Herbert spotted a picture of movie idol Rudolph Valentino, posing with a heavily made-up face and long hair. The singer came up with the notion of growing his hair long and covering his face with pasty white powder. To Herbert, this look implied romance and cleanliness. To his mother Tilly, however, it implied insanity.
He was acting so strange that his mother thought that he should go down to Bellevue, to the psychiatric unit down there for an evaluation, to see what was wrong with him. And you have to understand that in those days, when someone said go to Bellevue, they considered you nuts.
But Herbert's father, Boutros, stepped in to prevent the trip to Bellevue. In 1959, Herbert abandoned his other stage names and began appearing as Larry Love, the Singing Canary, at Hubert's Museum and Live Flea Circus in New York's Times Square.
It was a kind of entertainment arcade. I guess if show business has, 12 or 15 levels, this was really about the gutter. This was the lowest possible level. But, to hear him tell it, he really loved it.
Coming up, Herbert Corey becomes Tiny Tim.
He pulled out the ukulele out of the shopping bag and went into a song.
Strange, skinny, pasty, long-haired Herbert Corey longed to make a mark in show business, and he did by exploiting his two unusual talents, his warbly falsetto voice and his ability with the ukulele.
Tiny Tim was really genuine. You couldn't manufacture anything like that. It was just too off the wall and too bizarre.
In October of 1960, 28-year-old Herbert Corey signed on with a low-rent talent manager who charged him $25 for representation, plus a cut of the action. The manager touted Herbert Corey around New York's Greenwich Village as Larry Love. For auditions, the singer performed a falsetto rendition of Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Biographer Harry Stein.
Tiptoe was a great song. It was a great song when it was written in the 20s. It was a great song when people heard it again in the 60s.
Herbert needed a name as catchy as the song, so he went from Larry Love to Derry Dover. For 2 long years, Herbert's manager secured unpaid amateur gigs for his client in Greenwich Village cafes and clubs. Comedienne Phyllis Diller caught the act.
He's singing in this high soprano voice. He's got this awful hair hanging down. And yet he was so likable. And you just thought, oh, this is different. But it's nothing that will last. This is something that peaks and goes away.
In 1962, Herbert landed a regular paying gig at Page 3, a gay and lesbian club in Greenwich Village. The audience adored the ukulele player's kitschy appeal. Herbert's own sexuality was somewhat mysterious. He didn't date, although he became very excitable in the presence of the opposite sex.
The sexuality was always, obviously, a matter of some question. Of course, he was very fixated on women. He would give out awards to the prettiest woman he saw every year, or met every year.
For the next few years as Derry Dover, and then as Sir Timothy Timms, Herbert labored 6 hours a night, 6 nights a week, all for $96 a month. When Sir Timothy Timms was booked to follow a midget entertainer, his manager dubbed the lanky performer Tiny Tim. In 1965, Tiny Tim moved his act to a popular midtown discotheque called The Scene. One night, a talent booker from Merv Griffin spotted the balladeer and offered him a spot on the popular talk show. On March 7, 1966, 34-year-old Tiny Tim made his first television appearance on The Merv Griffin Show. Craig Tennis was a talent booker for The Tonight Show.
He was treated rather badly, and I don't believe ever did the show after that.
Soon after, however, Tiny Tim got the break he pined for. A Warner Brothers record executive, Mo Austin, spotted Tiny's act at The Scene. Record producer and friend, Richard Perry.
Mo Austin went to New York to sign Jimi Hendrix, and Tiny Tim was the opening act on the bill.
Austin was a shrewd record business veteran. He recognized Tiny Tim's earning potential, even as a novelty act. In the fall of 1967, Austin signed the strummer to a record deal. Tiny cut his ties with his manager and moved to Los Angeles to record his first album, God Bless Tiny Tim. Richard Perry was assigned the task of producing the psychedelic sound work.
No one in a million years would have ever thought that Tiny Tim would be able to make not only an album, but an album that I'm very proud to say was revered by the rock intelligentsia, by the public, by everyone.
In December 1967, Perry brought the bizarre musician to audition for a new NBC comedy variety show, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. Co-host Dick Martin was struck by Tiny's presence.
He walked in full regalia with his long coat and his shopping bag and walked up to where we were auditioning, and he pulled out the ukulele out of the shopping bag and went into a song. And I swear we thought that George Slaughter and Paul Keyes were putting us on. And they thought we had done it because none of us had ever seen him.
2 gentlemen came up, Mr. Slaughter, the producer, and they asked me, what do you do? I said, I'll show you. I actually took out the ukulele from the sack and immediately started playing.
I've never seen a room with grown men crying. I mean, everybody was laughing so hard, there were tears coming out, and I'd seen him perform countless number of times. I started crying as well. It was really amazing.
A month later, on January 22, 1968, Tiny Tim made his first appearance on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. Laugh-In executive producer George Schlatter.
NBC was concerned because Tim was unusual. And Dan Roan brought him out and said, wait till you see, this is our new talent discovery. And Tim went into Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Nobody could believe it. And everybody just loved Tim. And he was an automatic hit.
I'll tiptoe through the window, by the window, that is where I'll be. Come tiptoe through the tulips with me.
Coming up, who wants to marry Tiny Tim?
His words were, I saw her face and I couldn't get her out of my mind.
In 1968, the warbling Tiny Tim was introduced to a shocked and bemused American audience on the smash TV show Laugh-In. The balladeer struck a chord, but he would soon make a bigger impact on late-night TV during the first network televised wedding.
They had a 7-foot-high cake for the wedding and 10,000 tulips. And what an occasion that was. There wasn't a dry eye in the house.
After a successful first appearance on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, Tiny Tim became a regular guest. His first record album, God Bless Tiny Tim, was also a hit. Record producer Richard Perry.
The reception of the record, the exposure from Laugh-In, all of a sudden within a matter of months he was a household name on 3 continents. I mean, everybody in North America, Europe, and Australia knew who Tiny Tim was.
In March 1968, the singer auditioned for NBC's Tonight Show, hosted by Johnny Carson. Tonight Show talent booker Craig Tennis.
He had lank hair, which he washed many times a day, but still managed to look dirty. And he was shaped like baby Huey. He was very pear-shaped.
Tennis decided to take a risk and book the singer. But on April 4th, 1968, Tiny Tim's appearance went almost unnoticed. That morning, Martin Luther King Jr. was gunned down at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. As the news flashed around the world, Tiny Tim was singing Tiptoe Through the Tulips and being interviewed by host Johnny Carson.
And it was really rather distressing to have this extremely frivolous, although very entertaining spot on the air on NBC, while most of the other networks were simultaneously doing retrospectives on Dr. King.
Nevertheless, Tiny Tim made an impression on Carson and on viewers. The 36-year-old was finally getting national attention. And with attention came money. More money than Tiny Tim ever imagined. In the summer of 1968, Tiny Tim toured his act from London to Las Vegas. Laugh-In co-host Dick Martin.
He was exploited pretty bad with a manager who booked him at a Caesar's Palace at about $50,000 a week. He was as close to homeless as you're going to get. And he's given this huge suite at Caesar's. And he sat down on the floor and ordered everything on the menu from room service.
He found this girl hiding in the shower, and she proceeded to pour honey over his entire body and then slowly lick it off. This was okay with him because he wasn't in any way engaging in the sexual act.
Later that summer, Tiny Tim's book of poetry, Beautiful Thoughts, was released. The singer embarked on a publicity tour. On June 3rd, at Wanamaker's department store in Philadelphia, Tiny Tim caught a glimpse of 16-year-old Vicki Budinger standing in the crowd at the book signing. The singer was awestruck. Former manager Joey Capelluzzo.
The minute he saw her, that was the girl for him. His words were, I saw her face and I couldn't get her out of my mind.
Unfortunately, Budinger disappeared before Tiny Tim could talk to her. It was left up to road manager and bodyguard Jimmy Capaluzzo to contact the young woman.
He puts an ad in the paper, in New Jersey somewheres. Next thing you know, he gets a call. It's from her. Now I ask you, was she in love with him?
Tiny arranged a meeting. Within weeks, Tiny Tim and Vicki Budinger were standing face to face in Atlantic City. The chemistry between the lanky crooner and the nubile teenager was instant. In his typically formal manner, Tiny Tim referred to his new girlfriend as Miss Vicki.
Could have been maybe a month and a half, and then they were already talking about, you know, getting married.
Tiny Tim continued his book tour, and the courtship flourished over the phone. Then in August, the troubadour popped the question. Vicki said yes. In September 1968, Tiny returned for an appearance on The Tonight Show. Biographer Harry Stein.
When he first announced that he had a girlfriend, people assumed, and I think Carson assumed, that she would be a female version of Tiny, and invited him to have her on the show the next time he came on. And he brings out this very pretty young girl, dressed very demurely, and I think people were genuinely shocked. But Tiny always had extremely high standards for female beauty.
During his chat with Johnny Carson, Tiny mentioned the couple's impending nuptials. Behind the scenes, talent booker Craig Tennis and producer Rudy Tellez hatched a plan.
During the following commercial break, Rudy went over to Johnny's desk and whispered in his ear. When we came back from commercial, Johnny turned to Tiny and said, well, why don't you and Miss Vicki get married here?
Tiny said yes. The wedding was scheduled for December 17th, 1968. Public interest reached a fever pitch during the weeks before the ceremony, fanned furiously by the NBC publicity department. On the afternoon of December 17th, the parties met backstage at Carson's studio. Minutes before the ceremony was to take place, Tiny Tim got cold feet.
We were backstage before the ceremony, and he's saying, should I do it? I says, Tiny, do you love her? Do you feel you love her? I says, if you love her, I says, then we're gonna go on stage in a little bit. I says, if you don't, I says, now's the time. Things were starting to run in his head, you know, if it was the right thing to do. But then he just got over the nervousness, and when the time came, that was it.
36-year-old Tiny Tim and 17-year-old Vicki Budinger exchanged wedding vows on The Tonight Show. A record 45 million viewers tuned in.
He certainly seemed to be taking the ceremony extremely seriously. And I don't think he could separate the fact that being married on a late-night talk show in front of millions of curious people who were probably laughing at home was any different than any other day of his life.
In January 1969, Miss Vicki became pregnant with the couple's first baby. Coming up, Miss Vicki flies the coop.
I think this guy was a model. He's hooked up with him, and, you know, I guess one thing led to another, and that was more or less the turning point of things starting to go bad.
Tiny Tim's 15 minutes of fame lasted almost 2 years. But the clock was ticking on his career and his marriage.
Tiny was beginning to want to do things that I felt were not right for his career. And some of the ideas that he wanted to pursue, it just wasn't possible to do it. It was over.
By early 1969, television's most famous marriage began to sour. Tiny Tim's traditional values didn't thrill the more liberated Miss Vicki. Former manager Ron de Blasio.
Tiny had definite images of what a woman should be and a definite perception of how a woman should be in a marriage relationship. A lot of it came from his own head, some of it came from the Bible. He felt that the woman should be subservient to the man, so that immediately set up a little bit of a barrier between the two of them.
Just 1 month into the marriage, Miss Vicky found herself pregnant. 5 months later, while Tiny Tim and Miss Vicky were on tour in Houston, the baby was stillborn. Tiny Tim had the tombstone engraved, "It, child of Mr. and Mrs. Herbert Corey." 2 years later, on May 10, 1971, Miss Vicky gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Tiny insisted that their daughter be named Tulip. Miss Vicky reluctantly agreed, but she always referred to their daughter by her middle name, Victoria. The dispute over the baby's name was just one sore point in the marriage. Former manager Joey Capeluzzo.
Vicky got tired of the road, or bored.
Vicky told her husband that she wanted a modeling career. She gave her wedding ring to a photographer to pay for portfolio photographs. It was at the photographer's studio that Vicky met 18-year-old model John Carmen.
That was more or less the turning point of things starting to go bad.
Miss Vicky began seeing the male model. In late 1971, while Tiny Tim was touring Australia, Vicky took her daughter Tulip and moved out. Tiny Tim returned to an empty apartment.
He found out they were having some sort of a relationship.
Tiny Tim was the last to know. After 2 years of marriage, Miss Vicky filed for divorce on March 6, 1972. Tiny Tim, who was high-strung before Miss Vicky left him, became even more unbalanced.
He would go on eating binges and cosmetic binges. There always was a correlation between the two.
Record producer and friend Richard Perry.
Tiny had a thing about eating because he was so kind of removed from normal sexual activity. I think eating was the most sexual act that he was able to engage in.
While on the road touring, Tiny Tim created his own fantasy world.
One of the managers described at one point going to Tiny's room late at night and became aware of the fact that Tiny was moving from chair to chair, pretending to have a dinner party.
He must have been very lonely, you know what I mean? That the only one he could talk to was himself at the time.
Lonely and compulsive, especially about his fear of germs, Tiny Tim only allowed utensils sealed in plastic to touch his lips. And he took frequent showers.
Well, he would shower, sometimes 6 or 7 times a day. And he was highly perfumed. I think this was linked to his religious views, too, that he had to be pure of body and pure of soul.
He would relieve himself, and then he had to get in the shower. It would not be a short shower, I might add. And then come out with the same dirty clothes that he had before.
By late 1972, de Blasio had had enough.
I flew to Vegas and met him backstage and shook his hand and said, "Tiny, it's time for us to part. It's over." And walked away.
When de Blasio quit, road manager Joey Capeluzzo filled in. But interest in Tiny Tim's act began to dry up. In 1973, Tiny's father, Boutros Corey, passed away due to complications from diabetes. Tiny Tim's cousin, Bernie Stein.
After his dad died, he moved his mother out of that neighborhood, moved her down to 72nd Street to the residential hotel, and he lived with her there.
Coming up, Tiny Tim comes face to face with death.
The man drove across the divide and came onto the oncoming traffic and hit them dead center.
Tiny Tim's rise to stardom was quick. So was his descent. His wife left him, his career faltered, and his father died. But the worst was yet to come.
Tiny's appearances began to dwindle more and more. And since Tiny really didn't care how little money he made, he would perform no matter how sparse the audience was.
In 1973, Tiny went on tour with Roy Radin's America's Vaudeville Show in an effort to recapture his fame. Every night, Tiny Tim would belt out his Tin Pan Alley songs, accompanying himself on the ukulele. He was backed up by 2 female singers named the Tulips. But Tiny Tim's reluctance to spice up his repertoire frustrated new manager Joey Capeluzzo.
I told him, I says, Tiny, you have to change. I says, you can't stay. I says, today's generation don't want to know about 1896 and 1910 and 1920.
Tiny Tim turned a deaf ear to his manager, and the America's Vaudeville tour rolled on. One afternoon, while passing through Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, Tiny Tim and his troupe were sitting in their tour van waiting for a light to change, when disaster struck. Tiny Tim's former bodyguard and road manager, Jimmy Capeluzzo.
I noticed this car coming off a highway, kicking up dust. I said, boy, look at that guy, he's really speeding.
The man had a heart attack and drove across the divide and came onto the oncoming traffic and hit them dead center.
Tiny Tim suffered a punctured lung and 6 broken ribs. Recovery took nearly 4 months.
It was like a disaster because of the fact that we spent months getting this new act together, which we had high hopes for, because with his own backup group, they knew just what to play, how to play it, and the girls knew just when to come on and do what they had to do. It all looked great, you know. And then it just went down the drain.
Tiny Tim and Joey Capeluzzo called it quits. The performer's career went into a free fall. Even his rare TV appearances were more insult than opportunity. Biographer Harry Stein.
By the time I saw him later on, it was called a charity booking, that they brought him on because they felt they owed it to him.
He performed in second-class lounges. He performed in motel lounges throughout the nation. He performed any place where there would be an audience.
While Tiny Tim was touring the nation's backwaters, Miss Vicky pursued a divorce through the courts. Tiny Tim refused to cooperate because the idea of divorce contradicted his religious beliefs. Meanwhile, Miss Vicky posed nude in Oui magazine in October 1975. She also worked as a go-go dancer at Minnie's Lounge in Camden, New Jersey. Tiny Tim rarely saw his daughter Tulip and provided little child support. Miss Vicky was forced to go on welfare. Finally, in 1977, Miss Vicky and Tiny Tim were formally divorced. Without money or prospects, Tiny Tim retreated to the small apartment he shared with his mother in a Brooklyn residence hotel. For the next few years, Tiny Tim lived meagerly and took whatever work was offered, including a gig at a trailer park bar. In 1984, Tiny joined the Alan C. Hill Great American Circus.
That's right. Has been star singer in the circus at any time who's sung half this long. The Wall Street Journal came down and said, how can you travel, from Las Vegas to the Mud Show, they called it. And I said, frankly, you haven't got the right idea, you know. This is like the last living part of vaudeville.
Coming up.
He just stick his hands in it and pull it out and eat it with his hands, and then down it with the beer.
By the early 1980s, Tiny Tim was living in obscurity in a Brooklyn residence hotel. His first marriage was a fading memory, and an accident on tour left him laid up for months. Just when Tiny Tim least expected it, a new woman entered his life and stirred things up.
The worst part of marriage is that you lose that loving feeling.
In the summer of 1984, at age 52, Tiny Tim's heart was stolen by a mysterious beauty, 34-year-old Jan Allweiss. The couple met at a party, and the attraction was immediate. After a brief courtship, the couple secretly wed in the Caesars Palace Chapel in Las Vegas on June 26, 1984. Tiny Tim brought Miss Jan home to live with his mother. By all accounts, Miss Jan was unhappy in the cramped apartment and unwilling to stay with Tiny Tim's mom while the performer went on the road. Just weeks after the wedding, Miss Jan walked out.
They had kept separate residences, and she was like a mystery woman.
If the marriage lasts, it's because she kept it.
Then, in 1986, Tiny Tim's mother quietly passed away in her sleep. Despite an often volatile relationship, Tiny Tim was devastated.
He was deeply affected when his mother died. His mother was, I think, he was much closer to his mother.
Tiny Tim recovered from his loss, and in 1987, he got a new career opportunity, an acting role. Tiny Tim played a demented clown in the low-budget horror movie, Blood Harvest.
I may get confused sometimes since my accident, but inside, I still fly like I used to.
Director Bill Rebane.
He had a tough time remembering lines, which is strange because, you know, his songs, the repertoire of songs that he knew, was just incredible. He was unsure as a dramatic actor.
Still, Bill Rebane wanted to work with the performer again. He thought that Tiny Tim would be a natural for a children's show the director had in mind. But one thing got in the way.
He was afraid of children. He was really afraid of kids. He made a remark like, "They're smarter than you think," whatever that means.
The proposed show, Tiny Tim and Friends, was never picked up by a TV network. In April 1988, Tiny recorded a country song titled "Leave Me Satisfied." The little ditty failed to rise above 70 on the charts. 1 year later, Tiny Tim hooked up with the members of a polka band, Brave Combo. Tiny Tim and the band began collaborating on an album called Girl. But the partnership wasn't always smooth. Band leader Carl Finch.
There was one time that I literally went screaming from the studio because of how he wanted to do some things, but he would improvise at will for sure. We would just let him kind of float off into his own fantasy land.
During the recording of the album, record producer Bucks Burnett introduced Tiny Tim to a beautiful 20-year-old friend named Stephanie Bond.
Meeting Stephanie turned Tiny Tim's world upside down.
However, Tiny Tim didn't have the same impact on Miss Stephanie. The more she retreated from his attention, the more Tiny Tim obsessed over her. In the end, Tiny Tim's puppy love almost cost him his friendship with Bucks Burnett.
Tiny just abruptly and mysteriously ceased all communication with me, and this period lasted for 3.5 years. He was so obsessed with Miss Stephanie that he could no longer bear the sound of my voice because I reminded him of her.
The album was shelved. Tiny Tim's enterprising attempts to jumpstart his career took a turn toward the absurd. In 1990, the performer ran unsuccessfully for mayor of New York City. In 1992, he signed on as running mate for perennial presidential candidate, comedian Pat Paulsen. While his political efforts failed, Tiny Tim continued to play low-rent venues. His odd behavior became even odder.
I use one a day instead of underwear. It keeps me nice and clean. It's so sanitary. I wish the pen would make an elastic underwear like that, throwaways up to the waist, so I don't have to use those cumbersome straps.
He would go through 3 or 4 big jars of gefilte fish at a time. And probably 6, 8 pieces of fish in a jar at a time. And he'd just stick his hands in there and pull it out and eat it with his hands, and then down it with the beer.
When it appeared the singer's career was at an all-time low, Tiny Tim was invited to be a guest on Howard Stern's radio show. Former manager Glenn Knight.
His career really started to change when Howard Stern started inviting him on his show. And that changed a lot because people started to hear Tiny every day and really realized that this was not an act.
The appearances on Howard Stern brought Tiny Tim back into the limelight, and his bookings increased. Tiny Tim enjoyed the renewed attention, but after 10 years of being in a dead marriage, he wanted out. In 1994, he asked for a divorce from Miss Jan, and the two went their separate ways. Tiny Tim's penchant for binging and beer finally caught up with him. He was diagnosed with diabetes. Despite his condition, he continued to perform.
And he said, "I have a show to do in 2 hours and I'm going to go play." And he wouldn't listen to the doctors.
Coming up, an angel tries to rescue Tiny Tim.
Granted, there was 40 years difference between the two of them, but she truly loved him.
At age 62, Tiny Tim's health was failing, but his appetite for beautiful young women continued unabated. In 1995, the performer met 39-year-old Harvard graduate Sue Gardner in Minneapolis.
The fact that when he got married to Miss Sue, I think it was a turning point in his life.
Miss Sue had adored Tiny Tim since she was 12 years old. After flying the singer to Minnesota to discuss a music documentary, her feelings for Tiny Tim proved more than mere childhood infatuation.
It was the first stable relationship he had. Miss Sue was the best thing that ever happened to him.
After a whirlwind romance, Tiny Tim married Miss Sue on August 19, 1995. The daughter of a wealthy industrialist, Miss Sue had more than enough money to support her new mate. But Tiny Tim was not cut out to be a house husband. The charismatic crooner vowed to sing songs as long as there were people willing to listen.
Tiny would perform for 10 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, whatever. As long as you'd let him sing, he would continue singing.
On August 20th, the day after his marriage to Miss Sue, Tiny Tim bid goodbye to the new Mrs. Corey and returned to the road. Tiny Tim also reconnected with the band Brave Combo and finished work on his album, Girl. The disc was finally released in the spring of 1996. On September 30th, while appearing at Massachusetts Uke Fest, a celebration of ukulele music, Tiny Tim suffered a heart attack and collapsed.
Well, he had stumbled off the stage and fainted. I was shocked.
The singer was rushed to the Franklin Medical Center in Duxbury, Massachusetts, where cardiac specialists revived him. Despite his brush with death, Tiny Tim wouldn't stay put.
Doctors were talking to him, and he said, I have a show to do, and he pulled the IV out.
1 month later, Tiny Tim was performing Tiptoe Through the Tulips for the Women's Club of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Suddenly, he stopped singing. Tiny Tim staggered away from the microphone and collapsed into Miss Sue's arms. He suffered a fatal heart attack. Tiny Tim was pronounced dead at Hennepin County Medical Center on November 30th, 1996. He was 64 years old. He left behind a loving wife and an estranged daughter. On December 4th, 1996, hundreds of family and friends gathered to pay tribute to the memory of Tiny Tim at the Basilica of St. Mary outside Minneapolis. The phenomenon of Tiny Tim confounded critics, but his appeal was undeniable.
I think some people just sort of got off by the sight of somebody like this who was so completely weird, wacky, and wonderful.
An entertainer with irrefutable flair and an artist of immeasurable passion, Tiny Tim burst onto the scene at the height of America's Cultural Revolution. He endured 2 broken marriages and lost countless millions. But through it all, Tiny Tim did what he wanted to do most: play his unusual music for anyone who would listen.
He had unbelievable perseverance. If Tiny had never become famous, he would have remained what he had been in the 50s. He would have played little clubs, he would have played street corners, he would have played anywhere that he could have gotten an audience, because he soaked in that kind of attention. He needed it. He loved it. He died on the stage, for God's sake. That's the death he would have chosen.
But I do believe also that we're going to make contact with outer space. As I said so many times, the time is coming nearer. This world is going up and out of here. We're about to see things we've only read in science fiction about to come true. I can't describe this feeling. This will be a scary, scary feeling. This is coming so close. I don't know if I want to live to see this.